Hello, my name is Dinis Guarda, and welcome to my podcast and the Cities ABC platform that we've been displaying for some time. I'm here to talk about ideas and the biggest solutions to the problems humanity is facing, questions and challenges, and how we can think bigger and out of the box and make the world a better place and a bit one day at a time. I conduct series of interviews and profiles with global top thought leaders, influencers, experts, and people shaping and creating new narratives, solutions for our world, both with software and with ideas and projects of research, and as well how we can shape and find new solutions for business industries. This podcast and videos are part of the platform I founded, citiesabc.com. That is a new wiki for AR, intelligent smart cities, tech digital platform for reinventing and uniting cities, universities, organizations, and all of us citizens. Today, I'm here with Armando Gonzalez, that is joining us, I think, from Spain, and is the CEO and co-founder of RavenPack. Armando is leading a cutting-edge new platform, that is RavenPack, that is a provider of big data analytics for financial institutions. So it's almost like a new Bloomberg, but it brings a lot of new tools and analytics that are quite exciting, and is as well a recognized academic and business leader that has been speaking conferences around the world and has a degree in economics and international business administration from the American University in Paris. Welcome to our podcast, Armando.
Thank you again for the invitation.
So a pleasure to have you here. I'm very excited about RavenPack, and that's why I decided to invite you to the interview. So I think doing what you're doing is critical, especially when you look at data. But before we go especially to RavenPack and all the software we're building, can you tell us about you, your background, and a bit of education, and what you've been doing so far? I think it's always interesting to contextualize the history of the person.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from California, but I have a Latin background, and I studied most of my life in the U.S. until I moved to France, where I did my university degree in economics, as you mentioned, and more importantly, I started thinking a lot about computer science and how I could mix both finance and economics with technology, which was always my passion since I was a little kid. And right after college, I started RavenPack, which is the company I currently run, and it's been a great personal project for me in that it started off as a passionate idea around artificial intelligence and how we could use technologies that could help us think better, not necessarily replace us, but rather make us more efficient and more capable of understanding large amounts of information. And my background in finance was a good sort of connection with that as I started meeting very interesting, smart people that knew about AI and knew about developing and engineering solutions that would help us process things like news and filings and public, rather unstructured information that is very difficult for us humans, right, to do so in an efficient manner. So in general, these things have kind of come together for me as an opportunity to actually create a business out of it and create a company, which is not always easy, but at the same time, it's been a great way for me to basically enjoy every day of my life doing something that I really like, working on very hard problems and meeting some of the smartest people in the world that have really interesting ideas around the use of data and how to take advantage of information for the better of humanity.
Yeah, fantastic. So can you tell us a bit about the background, how especially you touch AI and data, which is critical, and I think special financial services are probably the most advanced industry using especially AI and all the fintech areas. So before we go to RavenPack, what from your education, working financial services, how would you see the evolution of fintech first, and second, data in financial services, and then of course recently more and more the AI integration on data and trading and so forth?
Yeah, I think finance is one of the most interesting spaces, not necessarily because it's full of bankers or greedy people, but rather people that actually care about developing cutting edge technologies. Finance was the first to incorporate real-time event processing technology. they deal with so much information that they've had to really invest in managing and creating analytical technology that tries to make sense of large amounts of stock information, fundamental information, news, and any information that is revealed publicly about investable assets. So in essence, I've seen finance transform in the last 20 years. Right after the dot-com bubble bust, if you may, the finance community really focused on trying to be more effective in understanding all the risk factors that influence pricing. And we saw essentially a group of very sophisticated data scientists start hedge funds and start asset management firms with this notion that if they were able to process all of these various factors in a very quick and efficient manner, then rather than being able to predict markets, they would essentially be better at processing the data and get an advantage over their competitors. And while it's not a crystal ball, it's a technology infrastructure that permits the ability to get ahead of your investable competitors, if you may, by being quick at ingesting all the information about executives, about products, about the market, about the economy that may impact the pricing that investors will assign to specific assets. But if you're able to do it in a millisecond, right, in a few milliseconds, then you can definitely be more efficient. And that was something that really drove my interest. I also noticed that most investors and banks were very heavy on traditional data. They've been using market data and fundamental data for most of their careers. But we brought something different to the table, and that was what we now call alternative data. Essentially, being able to gather what really drives investors, the causes and then the actions, if you may, of investors before they decide to buy or sell an asset. And the only way you can do that is by trying to probe in their emotions, if you may, the sentiment of investors. And how do we go about doing that? Well, you basically look at everything investors read. What newspapers do they read? What blogs do they subscribe to? What magazines or journals do they normally consult in order to make an investment decision? And it was in those areas where we thought the use of technology would be very helpful in trying to make sense of what people would ultimately use to make their decisions. So this space has been very exciting in that all these different problems, while driven by the desire to be more effective at buying and making better decisions in terms of what you invest in, have really driven some technological change and a technological revolution in big data and AI that I have not seen other sectors do. And while healthcare perhaps is the closest, finance has been at the cutting edge since the beginning of information technology.
So picking on think, and I'm particularly interested in that, being someone in the financial industry and fintech for a long time. So from your experience, if you look at the evolution of fintech, so we have right now almost like a big challenge is that the fintech industry is becoming more and more advanced, and we have like big players and legacy systems playing together, and of course central banks as well with a lot of challenges. So before you go to RavenPack and cutting edge stuff you're doing, so can you tell us a bit about how do you see that part? And I'm interested as well as you as a CEO and an industry leader, how we cope with that, because it's a big challenge that we're facing. We have all this advanced technology we're building, but at the same time, we have a lot of challenges in dealing with legacy systems and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the problems that we face today, especially at the high level where decisions need to be made, is that most leaders are not data driven, right? Most leaders are emotion driven or intuition driven, politically driven, but they're not accustomed to consulting the data and letting the data tell you what you should do. And this is perhaps more of a scientific approach to problem solving. But in decision making, in politics specifically, I think this is where we all struggle. And leaders don't trust data, don't trust the scientific process, and don't trust the data-driven process. I think that's one of the fundamental changes that will take perhaps a long time, and it has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with us humans and how we've evolved and the state that we're in. The second thing I would say is, in general, while technology is evolving very, very quickly, there are still many issues around data collection, right? And there's definitely been a significant boost in compute and storage and cloud services that makes things a lot easier and faster. But being able to get the right data is still very much at the heart of every AI problem across all industries. And we believe that having good data, having good collection processes, these are the kinds of things that really create the correct foundation for any kind of modeling. If we take a look at what's happening, currently with COVID-19, the biggest problem that we have today is still very much the collection of data around confirmed cases, around recoveries, around real death rates, and then secondly, being able to test people, right? And that's, again, part of the data collection process, being able to properly diagnose and test people around the world in order to truly understand what the problem is. But we, I think, all agree that we're working with incomplete data in this particular problem, and the decisions that we're making in general are based on flawed information, right? And ultimately, we revert back to these emotional approaches, this intuitive approach, perhaps driven more by our own biases than what is really good for society or what's really good for mankind in general.
Yeah, I want to touch that because that's as someone that has been working in investment banking and as well with a lot of digital and fintech big platforms and some unicorns. One of the things I found out is that we have right now, and you touch a very important point, is the importance of looking at data from a scientific perspective and not from a biased perspective. But of course, we are humans, and unfortunately, we have this challenge. So one question I have as well on the thought leadership part, and as well as your work as a CEO, but as well as an industry leader. So when you look at financial markets, we have right now a massive challenge, is that we have most of the financial data being used for capital markets. It's digital, and most of the big banks and investment banks and hedge funds are using quantum computing for these things and a lot of other things. But then when we look at central banks that are emitting money in crazy ways, we have not a logic. And as the machines become more and more important to look at numbers, one of the questions I have is, how can we cope with the irrationality of the politics, and as well, especially the financial, some of the countries emitting money in quantities that is crazy, and then the reality of the machine and the logic that we have almost in the scientific way. So don't you think we're going to have potentially a massive black swan on the top of everything we have right now, specifically just looking at data? Because I'm talking about financial data and money data. So how do you see that from a scientific, financial data-driven expert, but as well building a company in that area?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions and very complicated answers, right? But I think that the first thing, how do we deal with our own biases? I mean, this is an evolutionary problem, right? It's not something that we're going to solve, maybe, you and I on this interview, or, politicians or central bankers sitting across each other is trying to make a decision for a better world. This is taking us, it's probably taking us, hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years to get to where we are today. And until we, again, embrace data and embrace information, embrace the scientific process as a society for making decisions, we won't see these biases go away in any shape or form. So I think that's a more general philosophical problem and an evolutionary problem. But what can we do today in terms of what's clearly evident and available for us? I do believe that when it comes to economics, I think sentiment has become an extremely important factor in any kind of investment decision or any kind of money allocation strategy. Sentiment is essentially the way we feel, the way we think to some extent, but act in sometimes irrational ways. And we tend to think of positive and negative sentiment as an easy way of quantifying what investors and what society is thinking or feeling in general. And these things can be probed, perhaps unfortunately, by analyzing news and analyzing blogs and analyzing basically everything that we see. And it's proving to become a world that is being manipulated to some extent, right, by the media and by the information outlets that are out there. So we can predict a lot of our behaviors. We can predict the sentiment, how we're going to feel, by actually analyzing what we're going to read and what we're going to see, right? And it has nothing necessarily to do with our inner workings of our brains, but it has to do with the information exposure that we get and our location and our tendencies and our biases to some extent. But some of these biases are easy to model. And now you simply look at the information you feed these individuals, and you can ultimately understand whether this either propenses their ability to continue thinking the way they have, or whether there's certain types of information that they will be exposed to that might change their views on certain areas. And this has everything to do with our tendencies towards elections, for example, or candidates, or it has to do with the decisions to pump more money into the economy, or be more concerned about health and individuals over economic sort of fear or economic issues. All again, these are things that we will continue to see change, and they continue to be big factors in the type of information that we read. And I think it's there where we will find answers, and less so in trying to understand the biases or the emotions, the inner workings of each and every one of us.
Yeah, that's a critical element for the financial industry. So one last question in the top level macro question. So how do you see capital markets and as well the financial industry from a trends perspective, and from your main areas of work from a technology standpoint, but as well from an industry standpoint?
I mean, I do think that the market is still very much being driven by government decisions today, right? It does not appear to be a freely working market anymore, right? There's a significant influence by central banks across the world in trying to protect the economy as it used to be even 3 to 5 months ago. So there's a lot of government intervention, which makes the game very difficult to play. There's also a lot of decisions being made at the government level that, again, influence what investors do, and more importantly, that the types of decisions that are being made at the macro level are really driving even some of the more risky assets, right? You look at stock markets today, and despite the amount of negative news and despite the expected significant economic challenges that retailers will face, or the travel industry, among other industries, hardly hit by the coronavirus pandemic, markets are still fairly dislocated from the fundamentals. So this is, again, purely driven by sentiment, purely driven by information, and by what, again, governments and central bankers are going to do to try to save us from economic collapse.
So one of the things you're working is, of course, a lot of things related with predicting capital markets in relationship with AI. So you touched some of these things, but for instance, how do you see AI going forward in terms of the way the capital markets, and as well, I'm going probably to a philosophical question, but I want to touch that before you go to the product, is the challenge is that AI normally is built around humans that program machines to look at data, specifically machine learning and so forth. But like you said, we have governments trying to defend themselves, we have geopolitics, we have a lot of complexity. So like you said, I think probably we're going to be more dependent of sentiment analysis for capital markets than anything else, and probably AI will be on look on that. But in general, AI is much bigger and much broader than that. So what other things do you suggest from the AI applications you've been using so far, and as well some top level things that you consider on these areas?
Sure. I mean, as you know, from my background and my career so far, we've really focused on natural language processing, what is known as NLP, which is a branch of artificial intelligence. And that has and deals with anything that has to do with language, right? Understanding whether it's English or Russian or French, understanding the nuances of language, and being able to model and represent knowledge in the way humans communicate. Now that, to me, seems the essential sort of problem that we need to solve, and trying to understand, what we're saying, and create structure around that information so that other technologies within AI, like machine learning, for example, can take advantage of proper data collection and proper structure to try to mimic the way we ration, or the way we decide and ultimately make decisions, right? And that's where the scalability comes into play. That's where compute And cloud systems are very powerful in that we can do things that one human would probably do in a day or a month, would probably take just a few milliseconds for a computer in a cloud environment that both understands language and is able to learn based on new and incoming information. So these two areas for me seem the more exciting parts of artificial intelligence. Of course, we're doing a lot of work in vision recognition or pattern recognition, being able to assign and tag things that are in images or videos as either specific acts, whether it's an act of violence or a crime in the making, or being able to identify specific behaviors in humans. That's also very interesting, and being able to represent those in a structured way that computers can then analyze and try to make sense of patterns or connections. So all these things combined, I think, are extremely exciting. And it's not just for finance, right? This is where healthcare is coming and becoming very important. But this also affects practically every other industry, right? Where knowledge workers are essential. Right?
So now coming back to how you put that in practice with RavenPack. So RavenPack is a company that has, I think you have around 150 employees around the world, but especially in Spain, Marbella. So tell us a bit, how do you create RavenPack, and what is RavenPack for someone that never heard about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So RavenPack is an international company that focuses on big data analytics, and as you mentioned earlier, specifically for financial markets. We are a group of about 130 people, 30 something nationalities. We speak more than 35 languages and are based mostly out of Spain, but we also have our business headquarters in New York. Again, two areas that got heavily hit by the coronavirus. But at the same time, a very resilient team that has been quite successful at adapting to the current situation, where we have practically everyone remote working today and have been doing so since the beginning of the crisis. So this is an example of a company that is based off of different nationalities and different backgrounds, which I think is what makes us unique. And we all have a passion for engineering and AI specifically. And we really like developing solutions to hard problems. Finance is, as we mentioned earlier, and the economy in general has huge problems to solve. And data and machine learning and other AI capabilities are ideal tools for these types of problems. We've been in business for over 17 years now. I started the company, co-founded the company back in 2003, and have really worked on these types of problems ever since, becoming eventually a commercial success in 2008, 2009, after we created our first product. But originally, we were very much an R&D type of operation, but ultimately, figured that we needed to create products that helped us keep financing some of the work that we were doing. And so we did, and we've been successful at generating subscription revenue. We've been growing double digits every year. And we've also had some great luck in attracting venture capital investment as well. We have two VCs on board. Our first investor was Draper Esprit, one of the largest tech investors in the world. And our second and latest investor is GP Bullhound, again, another very innovative tech investor in Europe that is focused heavily on fintech. So with the backing of these two new investors, we've been able to finance some very exciting operations and projects across AI. And even today, we're really focused on solving problems that go beyond finance. And again, the example of our coronavirus news monitor was our first attempt to create a tool that was more applicable to other sectors and had a much more retail focused. And this is part of our projects to actually create new tools. I'll give you a quick sneak peek into something that we're working on. The company is actually trying to get for the U.S. presidential election a similar monitor that is able to track the news and the sentiments surrounding the two candidates in the U.S. So that's something that's coming up soon. But these are the kinds of things that we're really focused on today, trying to create tools that, again, are freely available to demonstrate what we do as a company, but also have a social component to it. And hopefully our information and our analysis can help someone interested in understanding how the information overload is affecting us.
So as a company going for 17 years, which is quite impressive, but you're quite young, so you start very young. So that is not conventional startup. So you've been building something very solid and then taking it and scaling it. Can you tell about that? Because I think it's particularly interesting, especially to demystify a lot of things about startups that do everything in 1 year and suddenly become unicorns. And I think you guys are becoming almost, in terms of the work, a new Bloomberg, which is quite impressive. So just a bit of that history of 17 years, which is, I respect a lot entrepreneurs and people that achieve what you achieved.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we are definitely the opposite of a traditional startup, right? And while we perhaps all entrepreneurs want to have these huge hits or home runs, right, that happen in a couple of years, the types of problems that we decided to solve were very hard, right? There were no textbooks, there were no user guides or manuals that we could follow. We were practically inventing our way into a space that had already been working on AI for 50 years, right? Even in the late 50s, there was work being done on AI, and yet nobody had really cracked the problems of natural language processing or machine learning. So these problems were very evident and very hard, and they just took a long time. We were just very stubborn, perhaps resilient, and really kept at it for many years until we found a good use case and a real problem we could solve. They could pay the bills, keep the lights on, and keep us working. So that is why, again, we weren't very focused on trying to generate immediate money and trying to satisfy, big venture capital investors that obviously put a lot of pressure on you. Our VC investment came 2-3 years ago. So this is, again, the complete opposite of what the typical startup would do. We decided to build a business, demonstrate we could generate revenue, became profitable, and then raise money.
Oh, that's very impressive. And I like, because it shows a very solid looking forward and I think systemic persistence in terms of business. So in terms of the product, and I think I would like to touch a bit that. So as a global finance, and you have there's a quote of yours that mentioned global finance and reach a critical inflection point as asset owners and money managers embrace tools like machine learning and big data analysis to navigate complex and turbulent markets. So we touch a bit about this, but I want to keep on this quote of yours. So from a product perspective and from a subscription perspective of RavenPack, so most of if you look at the financial industry, we have like the retail industry, but then investment capital markets that is increasingly dependent of tools like yours. And of course, all of them are using Bloomberg terminals. So what would be the difference between the Bloomberg terminal and your platform for the ones that are not so familiar as well?
Yeah, I think the primary difference between us and Bloomberg would be our focus on completely alternative data sources, right? Bloomberg is very much a traditional, fundamental, market data driven platform, and they're essential for a lot of firms that obviously need that type of information for trading and investing. We, on the other hand, focus on the causes of why markets move. And our philosophy is trying to identify the sources, what we call the root source, the root cause of investment decisions. And in doing so, we're able to gather insights that have an information advantage over the more traditional sources. By the time that someone buys or sells a stock and that gets registered as market data, we think it's too late, right? The decision's been made. So we focus on what are the factors, what are investors reading, analyzing, digesting, sharing before they decide to buy something. What are investors exposed to? What are they afraid of? What are their biggest fears that cause them to sell certain securities in different countries, and focus on that type of information. And the secret sauce, if you may, is really taking all this unstructured data and turning it into basic metrics, right? Turning it into indices, turning it into simple indicators that have a very common sense approach to putting the data together and behave very much like the traditional stock tickers or the traditional KPIs or fundamental factors. So it brings all these alternative views back into the roots of everything, and then creates a very simplistic, very familiar way of looking at data, similar to what Bloomberg does, except we're the alternative.
No, very interesting, and I think this is going to be increasing more important, not just for data from financial markets, but as well for cities, for countries, and a lot of things. Because if a country doesn't have this data, and of course we're seeing with COVID-19 all the challenges. So in terms of the product, and I want to go a bit more on that. There's a study actually in the book, the end book of News Analytics and Finance, that mentions your platform and talks as well how you've been established a premier firm in sentiment analysis and natural language processing. So can you just explain a bit the way you pick the data and the way you look at building the sentiment? Because it's very important, and you mentioned
Yep.
the scientific part of that. Because one thing is that at the moment we have a complexity of people not taking data seriously or not even getting the basic scientific, which is a big problem for people like us that are trying to do things in the right way. So if you could highlight that, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start from the beginning. The first thing that we do is basically curate a list of sources to track. We have access to about 1 million different sites, 1 million different publishers. There's everything from the traditional news wires like Dow Jones, or digital papers like the Wall Street Journal, or PR Newswire, Business Wire. Any kind of channel that is used by companies, by people, by governments to disseminate information, as well as websites or blogs. And all these sources are essentially being curated by our team, and we pick the most representative sources across the world. That means that these are sources that have a significant amount of subscribers, that have been around for some time, that are not considered fake news or fake information, that have a certain reputation, that follow certain writing style guidelines or journalistic styles. So essentially trying to create a decent foundation of information, but at the same time, a very diverse one. So we literally track, I think, 22,000 different sources, literally millions of articles every day. And these get ingested by these collectors that bring all that textual information into an environment that is able to classify and tag everything that is being said about companies, people, places, governments, politicians, you name it. So we've maintained this massive database of things that we want to track in the news. And then we use those sources to identify what's being said about them, whether it's good or bad, whether it's about inflation or deflation, whether it's about recession or COVID, whether it's about jobless claims or unemployment rising. All these factors and all what we call topics or events are basically detected by the machine that we've built, and they create statistics around what's being said about them. And what's powerful about this system is that, to give you some context, if you were to blink your eyes now, that takes about 350 milliseconds, just blinking once. So we're able to collect, tag, analyze, and disseminate all of this analysis to a customer in less than 200 milliseconds. So faster than we can blink our eyes, this machine has read everything, analyzed everything, and send it to someone that can make a decision. And that's where the real advantage comes into play. It's the speed and it's the accuracy and the scalability of this type of technology, and trying to make sense of all this information where neither you or I or anybody in this planet as a human being would be able to even think about reading or think about trying to interpret. And this is where AI brings a real additional value add to human decision making.
That's quite impressive, and I think it's so at the moment. Your product is open mostly to financial service, but is open to governments, to other things. So how do you right now take this to market? Right, well, you've been taking this to market.
Yeah, we have really for now. We've really focused on banks. So these are like the top investment banks in the world have been using our data for maybe more than 10 years now. But we've also focused on large asset managers, hedge funds. There are firms that do like trade surveillance and compliance within financial services. We're also being used by central banks for research purposes, for policy advisory as well. And anything that has to do with finance and the economy is our thing. That's what we're good at. The next phase for RavenPack is extending that and looking to specifically grow our data capabilities around ESG, for example, sort of environmental, societal, and governance issues. that not just affect finance, but affect corporations across the world and across different industries. We're also doing a lot of work around risk management and geopolitical risk. And these are, again, utilities and tools that can be very helpful for any kind of industry looking to understand the environment, both macroeconomic and geopolitical, and incorporating that type of information into every decision that is made from the CEO down to a line manager.
So one of the areas that I see that you particularly interest, and I think you just touched a bit on that, is ESG investment, which is critical because people want to invest in companies that don't have issues, and as well big funds and big banks and big organizations or even governments. They want to have like negative portfolio companies on their platform. So can you tell us a bit about ESG investments and how you tackle this through the platform and as well through your actions as a business?
Yeah, so through the platform, because we have access to so much public information, and both companies are required to disclose certain information, but there's very limited amounts of that, let's call it actively being disclosed or proactively disclosed information. And that creates an opportunity for us to turn the engine towards all the other information sources that may give us clues as to whether companies are engaging in certain activities or buying from vendors that violate certain rules, whether it's child labor or whether they're contaminating or polluting the environment in ways that are unacceptable. But these types of events and these types of information clues can only be identified through the use of big data, right? It is very rare that companies will voluntarily disclose some of this information, and we can probably expect that most companies will try to hide this type of information as much as possible. And that's where big data and AI are very helpful in trying to identify, other sources out there that give us clues as to whether companies comply with environmental standards, whether companies are actively engaged in the community and it's not just a PR stunt or the PR or marketing department promoting the company as such, whether the governance of a company is actually working properly, not just what we see from financial statements, but by looking at either comments from customers or partners or reading reviews or looking at even satellite data that tells us more about the types of movements or decisions that the governance or the executive team of a company is making. While we digest all this information, we're much better equipped to score these companies from a less subjective perspective without having to purely trust or rely on what the company discloses, but using all of the information surrounding companies to better score entities. And that's where the challenge today exists, right? That most of the ESG data out there is very inconsistent, is bias prone, has holes. Methodologies are, again, unaccepted by most investors. And RavenPack is trying to change that by bringing big data as the de facto approach to scoring companies for ESG factors.
So that is a critical element that touches all our society. And of course, we've been seeing from elections to a lot of things. And of course, financial markets being, well, if you look at Brexit and a lot of things and Cambridge Analytica, this is a big central fight and as well challenges. So how do you cope? And I know that you build a tool for fake news. So I want to touch that in specifically. How can you assure the security of this data and avoid these elements of fake news that affects capital markets, manipulation by politicians or by, well, a lot of social media spammers and things like that. So how do you look at these areas in particular? Because this is I think it's something that touches everyone, but specifically decision makers and increasing everyone in the world.
Right. I mean, at the moment, there is no systematic way of dealing with fake news, right? It still requires very much a set of standards. At RavenPack, for example, we have a series of factors or standards that are set to include a source as part of our analytics. And I think I touched upon some of these factors. One of it is the reputation of the source. That's determined by number of followers, the number of years that it's been in business, monthly visits. We also look at comments and general sentiment analysis around the source. We look at the number of historical archives and the frequency of publication. We look at backlinks and a number of other things. So we try to assess every source that ultimately makes its way into our core base. I mentioned we have millions, but only roughly 22,000 of these plus 1 million sources actually make it into our platform. So that gives you a sense of how much gets filtered out, right? And that's one of the main criteria, at least that we take to try to understand this. But again, this was a set of standards that we set that we believe are logical, right? And there's a lot of sort of human curation in identifying the sources. But once you identify a source, you need to trust the source, right? And if there is any fake information or misinformation inside those sources, it becomes a lot harder to detect, right? And that's where we create a series of indices and statistics that tell us if others start raising flags around a specific source. If some sources start flagging a specific journalist or flagging a specific topic as fake news, then that's another factor that helps us understand that. And this is what led us to the creation of the fake index indicator, if you may, for coronavirus news monitoring. And this is essentially relying on the curation that we've done, but also looking at whether people are calling out others as delivering propaganda or misinformation, or voluntarily trying to mislead people through fake information. And this index has been very interesting, specifically during COVID-19 and during this pandemic, as it's been fluctuating, over the last few months. And I think at the moment it's probably at one of its lowest levels. So it's interesting to see how it's peaked, and it seems to be stabilizing at the moment, perhaps because the general interest in, or call it the information congestion or overload that we're facing around coronavirus is so high that people are starting to fade and think about other things.
So I think let's go from the theory to the practice. If you could share a bit of the COVID-19 dashboard, that is fantastic, and I use it myself. And as well a bit of an overview about the product and what you've been doing. I think it's interesting for our audience, top level of course, but I think the COVID-19 actually is open to public. You are offering in your database, in your website, is as well on Cities ABC. So if you could highlight that, that would be really interesting for everyone looking at this.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'll do now is I'll share my screen, so you can see the monitor. So it should be up. Let me know if you can. Yes. You can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So this is coronavirus.ravenpack.com. This is our proprietary coronavirus news monitor. As I mentioned, it's powered by more than 20,000 sources of information. There are literally hundreds of thousands of news stories that are used to power each and every one of these widgets. What's interesting is that it first of all starts off by showing you cases, right? These are worldwide cases up to date. There's now over 5 million cases, over 2.3 million recovered. We're almost about to hit 350,000 deaths worldwide. We can sort of look at this in more detail and see, kind of how the curve's been evolving over the last month or last 3 months. And we can also, compare it to specific countries like, let's say, the United States. This is a sort of total cases in the US versus the world. And we can see it in logarithmic scale to see how the curve is flattening. So you can still sort of compare that. You can also read news stories across the world around different cases. Notice how each and every one of these headlines is about cases. And that's something that this thing is quite neat at picking up. But you can also dive into things like our panic index. This is what we have on the left here. These are the last 2 days. So you can see the tendency on panic right now, it's down a little bit. If we open it up, we can see how panic this is the beginning of the year. You can see how it peaked around March, right? March 30th, March 31st. That was like the top of panic, right? This is where every country is going into major confinement, lockdowns, quarantines all over the world. This is where I think even I personally felt, that things were in bad shape. And I'm sure a lot of people did as well. But over time, we've started to see panic drop, right? And if we look at the levels that we are today, the panic index is something, it has values similar to what we were sometime in the beginning of March, right? So this is, again, no surprise, but what's very valuable about this tool is that you can compare panic between sort of our global standard, and you can compare it with, let's say, the United States, for instance, right? And you can see how it's evolving in the US, where panic levels were certainly higher in the US during these periods. And even at the moment, panic is still a little higher than the norm. If we compare it against Spain, my home country at the moment, we can see that Spain had very high levels, right, compared to sort of the global norm, especially around March. But even today, you know, we're living in a country that has a lot of rules of confinement, a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of confusion around the politics in the country, and even changing or transitioning between phases of the coronavirus pandemic management. So this, again, perhaps is one of the major reasons why panic is so high, even still in Spain, right? And then we talked about media hype a little bit. This is our indicator that tells you how many, like what percentage of the total news is about the coronavirus. So about 50% of all news is still about the virus, but it's been going down over time. You look at the last 3 months, for instance, and you can see there's a significant drop. We also have our fake news index, and this is what we spoke about earlier. You can see how fake news was rising over time, and it peaked at around 22nd of March. So this was an important moment. We've had a few other peaks, especially in April, but levels today of fake news are also similar to where we were in the beginning of some of these lockdowns, right?
So on the fake news, I would like to ask one or two questions. So for someone that will be listening to our video podcast and here, so this is a very big thing right now. So can you just explain a bit more? So at the moment, so the peak was 2% of fake news index. So in terms of very simplicity, this means that 2% of the world news were fake. Well, how do you explain? Just I would like to go a bit more scientific here, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So what the fake news index measures is the level of media chatter around fake news or misinformation. That means that 2% of the world's news is talking about information being false, right? So people are making claims and identifying sources as being fake, or identifying sources that are spreading misinformation or disinformation, as well as propaganda. And this level is quite high in that if you think about normally when, you know, even before the COVID pandemic became, you know, made headlines, if you may, you could see that these levels, you know, would be below 1%, right? And even when China announced the first cases and actually called it as a coronavirus and not just pneumonia, the index was quite low. So when you see this like sort of exponential rise in this index, and more people are talking about fake news and are talking about misinformation, then we believe that's what influences sentiment, right? If people believe that information is fake, then it'll be treated as fake, and that's what this index tries to measure. You know, how much emphasis, how much concern, what percentage of the news is talking about misinformation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's actually quite interesting that probably I would suggest even bigger than what the index shows, but it's interesting to look at data. Because for instance, if you look at within Facebook and for instance, the European Union recently, even in the news there, is asking Facebook to tackle fake news, because you're not picking social media. This is just informational news. Because if you go to social media, it's much bigger now. Yeah,
much bigger. Indeed. Yeah, and you know, here's an example. I mean, we just contrasting countries, right? This is the blue is essentially China fake news. And you can see, you know, China news on China reached almost 8%, right, at some point, right? So a lot of misinformation around China when you compare it to other countries like Russia, for instance, right? You can also see, you know, similar sort of activity, right? Again, Russia much higher than the norm.
Yeah.
A country like Spain, or let's say Germany, you know, maybe would probably have, you know, some peaks here and there, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fake news out there. There's a lot of misinformation. It's very difficult to identify unless journalists, investigative journalists or governments, point to it and tell us, right, that someone's done the research and identified this as being a fake source. We do our part by curating the sources that go into our analytics. But at the same time, it's very easy, especially in social media, to get bots, to get programs that behave like people and start spreading and commenting information systematically to influence public perception.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think that's why these tools like these are fantastic, and actually for free, which is fantastic that you are offering this to anyone in the world. Okay, well,
yeah.
I think that this shows all the capacities, and I think, to be honest, it's one of the best tools I've been finding out, and not being very, very straightforward, because it's amazing what you put here all together. And as well, the related topics is particularly interesting. The topics, if you want to just show as a product part, this is very important as well.
Absolutely. So what's interesting about related topics is you can basically look at what are the main topics that are being talked about in the context of the coronavirus. So this is the section that we see over here on the right. So this means that 20% of the world's news is talking about social distancing, right? So this is 20% of all news that is mentioning the coronavirus or talking about COVID-19. The second biggest topic is fear, right? 12% of all news is about fear, similar to confirmed cases and staying at home, right? And you can also look at it from a percentage change. How is that changing today? So today's trending topic, if you may, is state of emergencies, right? This is probably lockdowns, either being extended or countries starting to move into some, new phase of a state of emergency. Fines is a big thing, and you can actually drill down into fines and basically see, is there a specific story like U.S. considering imposing sanctions on China? Again, this is related to the fines, to our fines topic, but this could also be about people being fined for violating certain confinement rules, right? But you can see most of the world's information about fines has been growing over the last 3 months. What's also trending today is crude oil. These are probably prices, and we can drill down into that. We can see that prices are pretty steady, right? We can also drill into the second wave. This has been a topic that has been an increased interest. You can see that over the last 3 to 4 months, this concern about a second wave has been rising across the world. If we look at this in the context of the United States, for instance, and we can just pick one of the topics that we want. So we'll do second wave in the U.S. versus second wave in the world as a comparison, right? And we can see that the U.S. is, even today, is actually bigger, right? It's 4.5% of all news is about a second wave versus 3.5%, which is the world norm at the moment. So a little more concerning there. We can dig deeper in there, and you can see sort of similar tendencies, but still higher nonetheless. So that's another big interest. And other things like Cold War or guns and ammo. These things seem to be sort of trending in the world. People protesting, I think, is going to be a bigger one. But what's neat about related topics is that it really quantifies the entire news spectrum, right? And in terms of what's happening everywhere in the world. And you can then, drill down to specific countries. So if you're interested in Brazil, you can also see what's trending in Brazil. So we have a very similar sort of structure, except travel ban is number 3 now. And that's probably as a consequence of the US imposing a travel ban on Brazil, right? So you can see the logical representation of our newsreader over here, which very much aligns with what's happening in our statistical view, right? And that's part of the idea here, to make sure that it still remains, there's some common sense, right, around the stats, and also what the machine is basically read to determine that something is spiking. And then again, Brazil has some interesting characteristics too, in that the panic index is still pretty high. It's around 6% of the world's news, still pretty high. And it's also worth mentioning that we have this thing called media exposure to the coronavirus. And you can actually see every country, but you can also see politicians, right? You can see the sentiment of politicians. You can see treatments, specifically like hydrochloroquine. This is the drug that President Trump has been taking, and that's probably taking 70% of all news about treatments is about this particular drug as a consequence of his exposure, right? Probably not the most effective one, but yet the one that gets the most media exposure, and hence people read about it, people become influenced, and that's the biggest fear, right, around its impact. And you can also see, you know, sort of other treatments and drugs, vaccines that are trending today. So we have a large database of them here. But we're also tracking, if we go to the global view, we're also tracking companies. You can look at airline stocks, right, and then see which ones are trending. SpiceJet today has the most of the news. Food and beverages, you can see Coca-Cola is at the top of its exposure. So these are all companies that are somehow exposed to coronavirus. These days, pretty much everything is getting exposure, but these are the ones that have the most, right? And that's kind of neat, especially from an investment perspective, to see, you know, which are the companies I should be more concerned about given their exposure to something as deadly as coronavirus.
And are you integrating this with any trading platform within your terminal, or this is agnostic? You can integrate it with any platform around the world.
Yeah, so everything that you see here, as you correctly pointed out, is free for non-commercial use, right? Anybody can look at this and use it for research or to disseminate it for any kind of application. If it's for commercial use, and we sell this data through the API, right? And most of our banks and banking clients and financial clients are and have been consuming this information directly from the API. So they subscribe to these feeds. They create their own custom indicators for the companies and the portfolio constituents that they care about, and then these factor in as another input into their typically quantitative investment frameworks, right?
Fantastic. Well, it's a great product. Thank you so much for the demonstration. I think we understand as well the power of the work you've been doing, and I think this is a great example because you touch all the different areas. And I think everyone in the world, especially our politicians, should be looking at this. Probably should be doing better decisions, but I will leave that for them to learn. Okay, so I think we're wrapping up the interview. I don't know if there's any things you want to highlight more in terms of RavenPack and about the different products you have. I think we're going to put all this information in the interview, and as well we are as well partnering with you guys. But I think it's interesting to look at the possibilities, because this is enormous, especially not just like you mentioned financial markets, but for healthcare, even for looking at data and information for media, and as well for activities in decision making and leadership.
Yeah, and I just, again, want to highlight that data matters, right? Information matters. Leaders, politicians, anybody with the power to make a decision that affects our lives as a society, as a community, should be focusing on the data, and they should look for the best information possible and not be afraid of letting science help you decide on our behalf, as opposed to your own biases or your own political affiliations or your own political interests. I think that's where we need to change as a society, and that's what RavenPack is really trying to do in our humble position, try to provide the best information possible.
Well, thank you so much. It's been fantastic, and Armando, is really congratulations for the excellent work, and I hope another 17 years of growth and a lot of success. Thank you so much.
That. Thank you very much.